Chapter 65, Transportation, Section 14. The escapes of prisoners might be called romantic, could romance enter the province of crime. While the First Fleet were at anchor off Tenerife, John Powers slipped down into a boat attached to the Alexander transport. He boarded a foreign ship. His offer to enter as seaman was refused. He then landed beneath some insuperable rocks. Assisted by the governor of the island, his retreat was soon found. Such was the first absconder. The determination to escape from New South Wales induced the prisoners to listen to every project, and to commit their lives to boats of the most imperfect structure, in which they were usually lost. But Bryant, an expiree, his wife and 2 children, and 7 convicts, escaped in a small fishing boat. He had purchased a compass and quadrant, and obtained a chart of his intended course. They provided food for the voyage, and the boat was in excellent trim. They were met at Timor by the crew of the Pandora, sent to the southern seas to arrest the mutineers of the Bounty. Bryant professed to have suffered shipwreck. He was kindly received by the Dutch. He died at Batavia, also one of his children and 2 of his companions. The rest were afterwards seized and conveyed to England, where the story of their sufferings excited the public compassion, and they were merely detained in Newgate for the unexpired term of their sentence. Their nautical intrepidity and their comparative success inspirited future attempts, but the most celebrated project was concocted by Irish convicts, who proposed an overland passage to China. Of 44 men and 9 women absent, the greater part perished on this curious enterprise. Some, after the absence of several weeks, reappeared, exhausted with fatigue and hunger. The governor, finding it impossible to prevent elopement by punishment, attempted to convince them by experience. He furnished some of the strongest with provisions and appointed them conductors, that they might proceed as far as possible towards the desired land. They returned, only partially convinced that flight in that direction was hopeless. The imagination of the prisoners pictured an Elysium beyond the mountains. A seductive rumor long prevailed that in the interior a community of white persons were living in primitive innocence. But many years elapsed ere the notion obtained the consistence of a story. In 1833, an account was circulated in England that white people were found several days' journey from the north coast of New Holland, in a village enclosed by a wall to defend them from the natives. They spoke in Dutch and stated that their ancestors, among whom were 12 females, came from a distant land, that their vessel was broken, that they travelled far towards the rising sun, that many died by fatigue, and the rest settled on that spot. A beautiful valley, on the borders of a lake. A full description of their habits and customs was given in the Leeds Mercury, but which can have no interest to such as disbelieve their existence. The young Lachlan, a vessel the property of Captain Howard, was seized at the Derwent by 16 prisoners in 1819. The sails were bent, the rudder was on board. She was freighted and provisioned for a voyage to Port Jackson. She lay outside the cove and was to drop down the river on the morrow. The 4 seamen were surprised and shut down below. The darkness of the night and a strong wind favoured their escape, passing the battery unseen by the guard. At daybreak, the pilot boat, with a party of the 48th Regiment, gave chase. A sloop, the property of Mr. Birch, with another detachment, followed. The boat found the seamen on Bruny Island, but both vessels returned without any other success. Arrived on the coast of Java, the robbers destroyed the vessel by fire. They then presented themselves to the authorities as shipwrecked mariners. Their story was believed, but at length they were suspected of piracy and imprisoned. Some of them confessed. All except 5 died at Batavia, to which place they were transmitted, and the survivors were conveyed to this colony by the St. Michael. The young Lachlan, not being on the high seas, their offence was not piracy. They were therefore charged with stealing only. Their punishment was necessary, but who could forget their temptation? One of the more common methods of elopement was to hide in the hold of a ship, often with the connivance of the sailors, until the vessel had cleared. Scarcely did a ship quit the coast during the first years of the colony without discovering, mostly too soon for the culprits, their concealment. Sometimes, to stir them from their stowage, the vessel was fumigated. Ships calling at Van Diemen's Land often delivered up absconders, found after they had weighed anchor. When secreted runaways were enabled to avoid detection until the ship had advanced far on her voyage, they were conveyed to England and usually surrendered to the authorities. A soldier, on looking down the hatchway of the Dromedary when returning to England, 1820, saw a spectre walking the deck below, who requested a glass of water. The soldier, alarmed, made known the vision, and after a search, a stranger was pulled out from among the planks with which the vessel was laden. Having said "we" repeatedly in speaking of his condition, the presence of another was suspected, and further search discovered his companion. Morgan, a Welshman who concealed himself, was more fortunate. Having made a considerable sum by his labour, which he was desirous of carrying home unbroken, he concealed himself in the hold of a vessel, and after a few days appeared on deck. He was carried to London and handed to the police, when he coolly thanked the captain for his passage. He had satisfied the law before he ventured on his voyage. The penalties on merchantmen conveying prisoners in a clandestine manner were sufficiently severe. The most remarkable was the instance of the General Gates, an American vessel, which carried off 10 prisoner mechanics and 1 free man, a double violation of the local laws. The Dromedary, store ship, was instantly sent in pursuit and captured the vessel at New Zealand. An action for £12,000 was instituted by the governor and awarded by the court in 1820. The judge, in his address, dwelt chiefly on the ingratitude of the defendant, who, being permitted to partake in a valuable fishery, had abused the hospitality of the country and had gone into low public houses to entice away their best workmen. This, indeed, was the chief grievance, and occasioned the rigour of the pursuit and capture. A stretch of power, it was deemed proper to compromise. It was made lawful to arrest any persons suspected of being illegally at large, and to detain them until they proved otherwise, the onus of proof resting with the person apprehended. Indemnity was provided for those who did anything in furtherance of the act. In defence of these powers, it was alleged that tenacity of the forms of British freedom was unsuited to a state of society, where of the adults more than 1/2 were prisoners, and to distinguish them was impossible. The government maintained that free persons, arrested in bona fide error, were bound to regard their consequent sufferings as a tribute to the welfare of the country. But considering the ungentle spirit and ruthless instruments of convict government, it was necessary to check these prerogatives with a considerable responsibility. The arrest of Mackay, a free man at Swan River, indicated the danger of undefined powers and the boundless arrogance of office. He was seized by the commander of a vessel and delivered to the Phoenix Hulk, New South Wales, where, loaded with irons of unusual weight, his clothing branded, he was confined with prisoners destined for a penal settlement. Having been brought up by a writ from the judges, he was discharged and retaken. Again the court interfered, and the man, never known as a prisoner, against whom nothing but a general suspicion existed, who had been torn away from a distant colony and exposed to the contemptuous treatment of those through whose hands he passed, owed his final liberation to the interference of an advocate and the firmness of the judges. He obtained £200 damages, against which the government appealed, unsuccessfully, as excessive. Absconding has been punished with various degrees of severity. By the first governors, it was held a venial offence. Before the law provided any specific penalty, it was usually flogging or a penal settlement. A capital respite was, however, sent to Port Macquarie. Within 3 months he absconded, with several companions, and started to reach Timor. On his recapture, he was executed without further trial in 1823. A colonial law of 1827 made it capital to escape from a penal settlement. It was intended to prevent a recurrence of those evils which resulted from the Macquarie Harbour elopements. That it intimidated a single person to whom the chance of escape was presented is extremely doubtful. That it rendered their efforts more desperate and their course more sanguinary is far more probable. No one will contend for the right of a prisoner to burst the bonds imposed by a sentence, yet will it never appear to justify the sacrifice of life. Such laws are useless. They outrage the common sentiments of mankind. More criminal than the offences they intend to prevent, they belong to what Lord Bacon stigmatized as the rubrics of blood. Their extreme diffidence of each other has rendered the combined opposition of prisoners impossible. A guard of 2 or 3 soldiers is sufficient to intimidate hundreds and to prevent an open effort to escape. The sentinels have generally displayed forbearance and consideration, the honourable characteristics of the British soldier. Governor Arthur recommended a declaratory statute to subdue any doubts respecting their right to shoot absconders, which seemed common among the military. That right had never been called in question, and in 2 instances only, during 14 years, was it exercised in this country. The sense of responsibility is a healthy emotion. Promptitude in taking the life of a runaway, however tolerated or authorized by law, could never be remembered by a soldier but as an odious execution. The piratical seizure of vessels lately has not been common. Escape is easy in other forms. The elopement of individuals has been attended with no great perils since the establishment of the surrounding colonies. Craft of small burden have been sometimes taken and at the close of the voyage dismissed. Prisoners have passed as merchandise or boldly submitting to examination have been lost. In the crowd of emigrants, a contrivance was recently discovered by the fatal consequences which followed it. A woman was enclosed by her husband in a case and on arriving at Port Phillip was found dead. These instances comprehend most of those forms of escape which are found in the colonial annals. They prove how powerful the passion for liberty, with which, when united to common intelligence, the threats of legal vengeance or the vigilance of official guards cannot cope. The same instinct, however, which induces men to break their bonds, restrains many more from transgression, and is a powerful auxiliary to the laws. Footnote: Clarke, executed at Hobart Town in 1835, and who for 5 years wandered among the natives of New South Wales, asserted he had seen an isolated colony of Malays, or some other nation, the remnant of a shipwreck, which had existed for ages on the borders of a lake in the far interior to the north of Sydney. This he affirmed to the last moment of his life. If reliance can be placed upon his testimony, the village he described is doubtless the same, and is yet to be discovered. Clarke addressed the people from the scaffold, acknowledging his crimes and imploring all who heard him to avoid the dissipated course which had led him to so wretched and ignominious an end. Upon this execution, Dr. Ross adds, "It is a matter of consolation that we have a pastor, possessed of the very peculiar, we had almost said tact, but we should rather say endowments, with which Mr. Bedford is gifted, for leading to repentance and affording all possible consolation to the miserable beings in their last extremity." Courier, August, 1835. James Hawkins, a celebrated pugilist and pickpocket, was not less remarkable for his escapes. He was transported to Hobart Town, where he found several persons who invited him to become a bushranger. He refused and devoted all his efforts to escape. In this he succeeded. Soon re-transported for life, again he stowed himself on board a vessel and returned to Weyhill and was again transported. On his way to the hulks, he once more got off his irons, but was secured in 1820. In jail he was orderly and quiet, and refused all enterprises which might have compromised his life. End of chapter 65, Being Transportation. Section 14.